Good afternoon, and on behalf of Flagship Pioneering, I'm Christine Heenan. Thank you for joining today's discussion on tackling common illness. Some of the most common devastating illnesses, such as diabetes and Parkinson's, have few and insufficient treatment options despite devastating effects. This is an area Flagship is committed to addressing on behalf of patients everywhere, and we look forward to an enlightening discussion today. We are thrilled to be joined by Karen Weintraub, who will moderate today's discussion. Karen is a prominent health and science journalist with USA Today, covering health issues, but you've probably also encountered her byline in the New York Times, Stat, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe, where she was deputy science editor. Karen's third co-authored book, Born in Cambridge, 400 Years of Ideas and Innovators, is due out this May. Karen will lead our discussion today with two such innovators from here at Flagship, Doug Cole, our managing partner, and Chris Austin, a Flagship CEO partner who until last year served as the founding director of the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences at the NIH. Fun fact, Doug and Chris served as neurology residents at Mass General a few years back. Over to you, Karen.
Hi, nice to see you guys again. Thanks so much for doing this. So as a start, maybe you can just sort of give us a lay of the land. What do you see as the problems that you think are ready to address? Want to go first?
You want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. If you look broadly at the landscape and the history of the biotechnology industry, there have been enormous successes in bringing treatments to bear for patients with a broad range of diseases that shows the power that the industry has developed. But at the same time, with a few exceptions, much of that resource is focused on very small groups of patients with particular types of, very particular types of cancer, very particular types of genetic diseases. And there's lots of good reasons for that, which we can discuss, but there's been less attention paid to patients with more common illnesses. And in fact, the number of people affected by these more common illnesses dwarfs the number of people with these smaller diseases. And so part of the question that this brings to mind is it time for our industry to turn some of its attention more systematically to trying to help people with these more common illnesses? And that's part of the question that we've been giving thought to at Flagship.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to?
Yeah, and I think from a personal perspective that I know Doug and I both share this, that we, at least speaking for myself, I got into this field because of disorders like Alzheimer's disease and schizophrenia and bipolar illness and Parkinson's disease and diseases that we now understand from a scientific point of view in some ways quite well. But if we're honest with ourselves and we look at, well, gosh, what is the experience of a patient now versus when I was in training in the mid to late 80s, for the most part, it hasn't changed much. And that hasn't been for lack of trying. It's just that the technologies that are required to make headway in these diseases have not kept up with the medical opportunity or the medical need. And as a result, over the last 20, 30 years, there's actually been something of an exodus of large and small companies away from working on common illnesses to work on, as Doug was saying, on the rarer disorders, rare Mendelian disorders, of course, enormously important to the patients and the families who have them. But on a population level, of course, by definition, less common. And so the question that we've been asking ourselves is, well, gosh, lots happened in the last 30 years. is it time for us to turn our attention back to the causes of suffering and death of 90% of the world's population?
Right. I was going to ask why now? What's changed, or why do you feel, why not 5 years ago or 20 years from now?
Yeah. Well, everyone has perhaps their own spin on that, but my take on it is that what we have now compared to when I was working on these disorders back in the mid 90s, late 90s, is first of all, we have the genome, which was completed, will be 20 years in 2023. Actually, it was not completed in 2021. Yeah. It was
completed
officially in 2023. And that allows us a window into life's instruction book that it has been absolutely critical to understand both rare diseases as well as common diseases. Secondly, back then, again, when Doug and I were training together as neurologists, we only wrote our medical notes, our observations about patients in pen and ink on pieces of paper that then got archived someplace, but they weren't accessible to researchers. And that's really changed too over the last, particularly the last 15 years, due to the funding and the mandates of the Affordable Care Act that led to a dramatic increase in electronic health records. And some of the experimental tools that we would have loved to have had that were science fiction 20, 30 years ago are now enormously helpful, potentially at dissecting these common diseases. And what I'm referring to particularly is the ability to make cells from individual patients, from induced pluripotent stem cells or stem cells of other sorts, as well as various forms of multicellular complex systems made of human cells, the apotheosis of which is a microphysiological system or a tissue on a chip, which is a little multicellular bioreactor that represents structure and function of all human tissues that I played a part in when I was at the NIH. And so I think all of those things make it at least reasonable to ask, well, gosh, isn't it time to pay attention again to the disorders that all of us are affected with and will ultimately probably succumb to at some point.
Right. Did you have something to add there?
Well, I think that some of these advances that Chris is describing, not only advances in genomic sequencing, but in manipulating genes in various ways, for example, with approaches like gene editing, increasing amounts of data that are being generated, both about the clinical presentation of patients as well as some of the underlying genetics and biology, and then tools such as imaging tools and the ability to engineer models and so on. What all of this really is now making possible for the first time is for us to really rethink from first principles the nature of illness and how we classify it and how we think about approaching it therapeutically. Even going back to the 80s, when we were caring for patients, it was very apparent when you would see patients with ostensibly the same diagnosis that often different people had very different diseases. That is, the course of their illness was different, their response to various interventions was different, some of the details of their symptoms and their findings were different. But we would lump all of these patients together and say, these patients all have rheumatoid arthritis, these patients have obesity, these patients have schizophrenia, and so on. And much of industry has essentially accepted those categories. And the problem that that's led to is, as people have tried to develop drugs for these heterogeneous groups of people, the trials fail, and they fail because of variability. So what we can now do is go back and say, here's a group of people who at the surface look similar, but as we apply data analytics to their clinical presentations, as we try to link those presentations with genetics or other biological clues, we can realize that they actually have different diseases, different biological problems underlying what's bothering them. And once we can get patients into meaningfully homogeneous groups, then we have a much better chance of figuring out ways to intervene, either to treat an illness that the patient has already developed, or maybe in the fullness of time, actually to delay or prevent the onset of that illness. So that's the exciting possibility that I think these advances in technology and the availability of information make possible now.
And what role do you see Flagship playing? Why Flagship and not academia or pharma, big pharma?
Well, I think that all parties can play roles in this, and it's very important that we're cognizant of what everybody can bring to the table, and we try to figure out the best ways of getting the benefits of that. But certainly Flagship has historically and continues to be driven by a combination of, one, asking the question, well, what if something were true? Would it likely matter to the world? Would it likely make people's lives better? And so I think that we can all accept that if we had ways of giving hope to patients who might be facing a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or rheumatoid arthritis or some of these liver disorders such as NASH, that the world would be a better place. So we're willing, based on that conviction that the future would be worthwhile, to then really ask ourselves, well, how could we possibly make it so? And that's because we know that if we can have that kind of beneficial impact, that will make the world a better place and will create value along the way. Now, of course, these things can't happen in isolation. Many academic centers around the world, for example, are at the front lines of caring for patients, acquiring data about those patients, and really understanding what it's like for the patient to experience these problems. And so they're a critical part of how we can ultimately make this reality. Likewise, some of the clinical trials that are required for ultimately proving that a drug works in these things are logistically very complicated and have to be done at a scale which some of our colleagues in the larger pharmaceutical companies are real expert at. So in the fullness of time, everybody is going to play a role, but I think that what we have to do collectively is embrace the importance of the possibility, and we're certainly willing to do what we can to take a lead role in that.
Can you drill down for us a little bit, get into the weeds a little bit on specifics? What would this look like for, say, Alzheimer's, where I know early trials failed because the treatments weren't early enough, and then, well, we had too big a population, as you were saying. You know, we had some people who maybe didn't actually have Alzheimer's who were being treated. How do these advances sort of make open doors, open possibilities for something like Alzheimer's?
Well, so Alzheimer's is a good example, and we should talk about that. But it's only representative. This applies to, you know, as Chris, I think, was saying, you know, many of the diseases that really we all worry about getting, or we worry about our family getting, and so on. And it's simply this. When people come to the doctor with something bothering them, there's a real imperative to put them into a diagnostic category. And what medicine has typically done is identified 2 or 3 key features of a set of complaints and said, when those features come together, then these patients have a diagnosis of X. So for Alzheimer's, as an example, it's progressive dementia without other identifiable causes. And what that fails to account for is if you look carefully at many of those patients, just at what's apparent clinically, there are differences. Right. And if you have enough data and the right kinds of analytics, you can find that some patients group together and other patients group together in a different way, and that over time, those differences hold true. The patients in the first group have a particular type of progression, the patients in the second group have a different type of progression. And then if you start digging down into the biology underlying what's going on with those patients, you find that there are real differences in the biology, what's gone wrong with their biology. And so how that plays out in drug development is if you haven't recognized those differences and you test your drug in all of those people as if they have the same biology, right, there's a good chance that you're going to fail. And I think that we've seen Alzheimer's is a great example of this. Unfortunately, lots of time, lots of money being spent without anything yet dramatically positive to show for it.
Yeah, and I'd add a couple of things. One is about your point about why Flagship. From my point of view, in addition to everything that Doug said, Flagship is only starts platform companies. It doesn't form companies that are only going to work on this disease with this target with this asset. There are a lot of really good companies that do that. It's just not that what we do. And in this space, we believe that the common features that we're talking about here of clinical heterogeneity, causal heterogeneity, genetic contributions, ability to model these for the first time in physiologically relevant systems, those are in common across all of these disorders. And so if we take a platform approach to this and say, well, everything we learn in disease A, we're going to apply to disease B, and disease C, and disease E, rather than picking off one at a time, which most companies or academic investigators tend to do because they're work in a particular area, that we'll be able to make more headway more quickly. And beyond that, we'll see an acceleration of progress as we learn from one disease and go to another. As far as the question of what a patient's experience would be, I'd contrast the experience with the kinds of diseases that we're talking about now with an admittedly imperfect analogy, but is cancer. So cancer is the second leading cause of death for the most part in most parts of the world. And there was a time when cancer was cancer. Right. And everyone with cancer got treated the same way. And they tended to be cell poisons, like nitrogen mustard, used in World War I as a warfare agent, was actually used to given to patients for therapeutic reasons, radiation, interventions like that, and the response rates were predictably poor. But when you go to the doctor, increasingly, and I can say this because my wife had breast cancer a few years ago, and she's doing great, thank you. But a very different experience, where her oncologist said, "I frankly don't care where the organ was. The fact that it was in the breast, I really don't care. What I care is her clinical characteristics and the molecular characteristics of the tumor, and as a result, her treatment was much more efficacious with much lower toxicity. So we hope one day, if any of us are unfortunate enough to become forgetful and perhaps have a clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, we wouldn't be given a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. We would be given a diagnosis of Cole's disease or Heenan's disease, where what that connotes is a specific causality a specific flavor clinically of the disease with a specific causality that's inferred from it, which then has led to a therapeutic for your particular brand of that disorder. And what that also promises from a drug development standpoint, a corollary of deconstructing the heterogeneity in these disorders, is that the sizes, the size of clinical trials, the length of clinical trials will become shorter, because it's a fundamental principle of statistics that the more uniform your population is, the more power you have at a given size. So with a smaller size, you're able to detect a change, a meaningful change, with a smaller population and in a shorter time. And I spent a lot of the last 20 years before I joined Flagship last year working on rare diseases, and I learned a lot from that experience. There are independent challenges of rare diseases, of course, but what's interesting is to think about the contrast in the success rates of rare disease drug development versus common disease drug development. The best numbers, which happen to come from bio, are that in the clinical phases, rare diseases have a success rate which is about 3 times the rate of a common disease. Now, that's exactly what you'd expect if you have an apples and oranges trial in a common disease, but only apples in the rare disease trial.
Right.
And what that tells you from a diagnostic point of view is that there is a 1-to-1 correlation between the diagnosis you're given and the mechanism of your disease. So when I say to you, sickle cell disease, your immediate response, I hope, will be beta globin.
Right.
Or I say to you cystic fibrosis and you say CFTR, or I say Huntington and you say the Huntington protein. You know immediately what the mechanism is and often the drug target. Now, if I say to you diabetes,
Could be 100 things. Right.
Alzheimer's disease, schizophrenia, there is no 1-to-1 correlation. We're back to the era of you have cancer. But cancer, to Doug's point, is an illness. It's not a mechanistic disease. And we develop drugs against mechanisms, not against clinical symptomatic groups. Just the last thing I would mention is that, this is not the fault of people not trying hard over years. But just imagine if you were Alois Alzheimer or James Parkinson, what you described was a person, usually a single person, maybe a small group of people, who happened to come into your practice.
Right.
And you had no idea what mechanism was. You had no idea what a gene was. You had no idea what a protein was. You had no idea what a drug target was. Drug development didn't exist. And yet that is the construct that we use to diagnose people, and the billing system enforces that. And then we use that to develop drugs. And though it works in rare diseases, it doesn't work in common diseases. But we think we now have the power, the technology, the data to be able to essentially convert, if you will, common diseases into rare diseases from that perspective.
So say I'm an Alzheimer's patient and you do a genetic analysis. I mean, there's going to be a lot. I might have 100 genes that are causing this situation.
Right.
And you might have a completely different 100 genes. Yep. How do you kind of simplify the problem, I guess?
Well, it's the first thing is we haven't figured it all out yet.
Obviously, or we wouldn't be here.
There's many people working on this problem. Certainly not us alone. But the important thing is that one of the important things is that one wouldn't go just with the genetics alone.
Right.
Because common diseases, the genetics of common diseases is not deterministic in the vernacular of the field. It confers susceptibility, increased susceptibility, given a variety of environmental factors.
Sure.
And so we would want to combine that with the clinical data. What does the patient actually have? What are their symptoms and signs? that might suggest that they have a particular form of this disorder that then combines with the genetics, but it's not just that we would have to have evidence in this person that those symptoms were related to a particular pathway or circuit or biological function disorder, which is manifested in their cells or in their blood or their cerebrospinal fluid or something, so that we would have, I'll use the B word here, biomarker of that response, because the genetics alone isn't going to tell you,
right.
But it's tremendously informative at probabilistically separating groups of patients, and this gets to the point that Doug was making. This would not be possible without some of the other current buzzwords in our field, AI and ML. Right. I don't actually use the word artificial intelligence because I think for the most part it doesn't exist. However, augmented intelligence does. And the volume of data, just think about this. If you take hundreds of thousands or millions potentially of patients, and they all have this different spectrum of symptoms, maybe 100 different symptoms or signs altogether, and they all have different combinations, and then they all their genetics, you have different combinations. And there's not one disease, one gene, there's perhaps dozens or even 100 different genes that are gone wrong, and not all of them will manifest in a given way. So the human brain is just not able to keep all that straight. Right. No matter how good your Excel spreadsheet is, you will never figure this out. And again, this is something which really has not been possible until the advent of democratized cloud computing in the last 5 years, really. I mean, if you remember back when the genome was sequenced, you may remember going through the Whitehead or through through Celera Genomics with these massive server farms of computers, and I'll never forget going through one of these, and they had these servers generated so much heat that they had to have an exhaust vent that was taller than me in diameter to do that. And that was incredibly expensive. Now, right. You just buy what you want from Azure or the Amazon cloud or wherever you are. And that is lowering the barrier of entry to little companies like what Flagship supports.
Did you want to, you seemed like you wanted to get in there, no?
Yeah.
Okay. And so what challenges from a regulatory perspective do you see then for this? I mean, if you've got a small patient population.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, so you know, you asked a little bit earlier, Karen, about academia and pharma and so on. I think that this is going to also require participation from regulators in how to think about these illnesses, in the sense that different types of illnesses have different characteristics that are more or less amenable to a particular regulatory approach. In the field of oncology, which has seen really spectacular progress over the last 20 or so years, there's been a very kind of practical regulatory approach that reflects some of the kind of typical characteristics of most cancers. That is, they progress fairly quickly. Unfortunately, the endpoints are either death or some kind of very severe disability, and those endpoints are easy to measure, and so on. And it's become, at least in a number of cases, fairly easy to link these clinical endpoints with biomarkers that indicate that they're likely to happen. And so that's made it possible to think about doing cancer trials in fairly small groups of patients fairly quickly, and so on. In other areas, even if we can solve this problem of heterogeneity, it's still the case that some of these diseases progress very slowly over decades as opposed to months to a couple of years. Some of these diseases actually wax and wane.
Sure.
And some of the endpoints that ultimately are the things that matter to people. Right. They live longer, they can maintain a higher quality of life, and so on, are very, very difficult to measure. And so from a regulatory perspective, there may be a need to kind of tailor the approval and post-approval process in a way that's still highly rigorous and still assures that you don't subject people to undue risk, but maybe focuses on different elements at different times than would be the case, for example, with cancer. And I think that by and large, the FDA and authorities in other jurisdictions have certainly indicated that when there's promising approaches that have the potential to help people who currently don't have good options, that they can be very, very thoughtful partners in this kind of thing.
And the FDA has been keeping up, as far as you're concerned, with this process?
Absolutely. I mean, there's always sort of examples where people become critical for one reason or another. But by and large, if you look at certain areas therapeutically and the kinds of progress that have been made, so for example, in cancer, which we've talked about, there's been a decrease in mortality of about 30% in the last 25 or so years, and a lot of that's because of the medications. There's other therapeutic, other areas such as cardiovascular disease, where over a little bit of a longer period of time, the decrease in mortality has been closer to 50 or 60%. And while that's not all necessarily because of drugs and the approval of drugs, right, a big part of it is. And so we know that it's possible, and we know that society can benefit, but it does take sort of an openness with respect to the details and how it's implemented.
Right. And when you bifurcate or truncate the market this much, when you're not talking about obesity or heart disease, but people with obesity and this profile, where's the business model here? Is that why you're talking about platforms, because you can do something across many diseases or many conditions?
So it's not necessarily the case that getting a clearer understanding of how people group in terms of their disease biology equates with tiny populations.
Okay.
What's important is that they share similarities in what is contributing to their disease, and that you can intervene in those similar features. So from a big picture perspective, I would not necessarily assume that what we're talking about is creating thousands and thousands of new niche diseases.
Okay.
On the other hand, drug development cannot ignore biology, and so you kind of have to let the biology guide you. Right. And you can't insist, that the biology respond in a way that's inconsistent with the facts. So probably in some cases, yes, there will be very small populations. Chris mentioned one of the benefits of this approach overall, which is that regardless of whether the population ends up being fairly large or quite small, the time it would take to do a clinical trial, the number of patients that you would have to test, becomes much less. And so that's a win for the drug developers, the people who finance them, et cetera. If you are able successfully to develop a drug in a defined population, then the chances that it will work in most of the people who get prescribed that drug once it's in the market go up significantly. And so the benefits of that go directly to the patients. Right. But likewise, from the payer perspective, if the trade-off is, look, we're going to reimburse at a rate that everybody ends up being happy with for this drug, but we're confident that it's likely to work in the group of patients who are getting it, right. Then they don't have to pay for being prescribed to the patients who get it that it doesn't work in. Right. So from a big societal perspective, there's a potential win for the patients, which is the centerpiece of this. There's a potential win for the companies who are developing the therapeutics, and there's a potential win for the people who are paying for it.
Right.
Yeah, let me make just a couple of points about about that in addition to what Doug said. So first of all, it's important to keep in mind that the numbers, as far as the segmentation of little populations, again, as somebody who spent most of his life for the last 20 years working on disorders that affected as few as a dozen people in the world, wow. Up to the limit of the Orphan Drug Act, which is 200,000. Most rare diseases are much, much, much less common than that, 1,000 people, a few thousand people. Now let's look at something like chronic kidney disease. Affects 37 million people in the US alone. Right. If we were to divide that by 5, right. That's still an enormous number of people. So from a strictly marketing perspective or a number of people to treat perspective, the numbers are still quite enormous. And it's important to know that what we're talking about here is not another buzzword, personalized medicine. We're not talking about a drug for each individual person. Right. What we're doing is much like happens when most of us go to the clothes store, right? So you don't go into the clothes store and order, in your case, a dress, in my case, a pair of pants. Or maybe you're getting a pair of pants too. But you don't just go in and ask for a generic pair of pants. What do you ask? Well, what are your characteristics? Right. What's your size? What's your, all that, but you don't go to a tailor. A tailor is personalized medicine. What we're talking about is Men's Warehouse, but that's an enormous improvement over a random dose of pants in this case. So that's the first. The second is about the regulatory environment. One of my joys of being at the NIH for 20 years was working with my colleagues at the FDA. Mm. They are incredibly smart, devoted people who I have found often are the ones who are pushing the envelope, trying to get companies and others to try new things. And it's often difficult to do that because, of course, the company is saying, well, tell me what the answer is before I do it. And of course, the FDA can't do that. But to your question, Doug's absolutely right that they are not only receptive but are desirous of these kinds of changes. The second thing is that most people don't realize is that FDA does not approve drugs for diseases or illnesses. It approves them for indications. Mm-hmm. And indications are clinical presentations of, in the vernacular of the FDA, how a patient feels, functions, or survives. And so by parcellating the clinical spectrum, the often very broad clinical spectrum of symptoms and signs, how a patient feels, functions, or survives with an individual disease diagnosis, if we're able to be more precise in indicating to the FDA which is the population and what is the clinical outcome, we're not going to affect all clinical outcomes potentially. We're going to affect the clinical outcome that is specific to this patient group. Then that's exactly the language that FDA speaks. Now, arguably the biggest issue will be for the community that Doug and I are longtime members in, that is the physician community, which loves its diagnoses, and they may be slower to change, but I think they'll come along too.
As the cancer docs have.
Yes, of course. Yeah, it's a great example, because doctors ultimately they just want to help their patients.
Sure.
And Doug hasn't said this, but one of the reasons that Doug and I got into this crazy business 35 years ago, and we went our separate routes, and now we've come back together again 35 years later, is that we were frustrated by our inability to give meaningful diagnoses, much less treatments, to the vast majority of our patients. And so given the ability to serve that mission better, which is why doctors go into this in the first place.
Right.
I think they'll
Come around.
eagerly adapt it.
Right. Question from the audience: What diseases are we talking about? What are the low-hanging fruits potentially here, and what are the hardest, longer-term kinds of conditions?
We each have our own group. Do you want to?
Well, some of these diseases have been mentioned. We're looking at all categories of disease and trying to identify ones where there's a combination of real unmet need, which is actually pretty common, so it's not hard to find that.
Right.
And where we think that the availability of clinical and genetic data now, our ability to apply analytical approaches to identify promising patterns and link the clinical patterns to some biological bridge, which is usually the genetics, and then to get insight into which circuits are dysfunctional by modeling this experimentally. So we're looking at autoimmune diseases, we're looking at diseases of the nervous system, we're looking at metabolic diseases, we're looking at kidney diseases, and cardiovascular diseases, and we're going to go where, as I said, the biology leads us. We already have some ideas of where that might be first. You asked what might be the most difficult. I think that our industry has yet to make real inroads into neurodegenerative disease, and so we're all very, very anxious to make progress there. And I'm hopeful that we're getting closer. But even beyond that are the psychiatric diseases. The major psychiatric diseases, of course, being schizophrenia, bipolar illness, and depression. And that presents yet another level of challenge because there's very few structural clues as to where the problem lies. And of course, the nature of the things that bother people when they have those illnesses is really, really hard to measure. I think that we're already getting some clues from the broader scientific community about ways to start thinking about these things. But that is an area of extreme difficulty that we would all love to make an impact on if we could.
Yeah, I guess I'd answer it an additional way, which is that this is a plug to doctors and clinical data systems. Doctors, please write down the primary data that led you to the diagnosis, not just the diagnosis.
Right.
You know, scientists, when you're trained as a scientist, I'm trained as both, it is drilled into you that you don't just write down the conclusion of your experiment.
Right.
You write down what you did precisely and what the individual observations were so that somebody else looking at the data can reproduce and come up, we hope, to the same or a similar conclusion. Doctors don't do that, especially with the 12 minutes that are available to see any patient these days.
Right.
You just
the 3 hours they spend in front of their computer screen at the end of the day.
Right. You just write down X diagnosis, and often, even as we all know, that's sometimes even colored by what the larger reimbursement will be depending on what the diagnostic code is.
Right.
It's just human nature, and so the limitation, we think, is going to be in quality of clinical data.
Right.
And we're making enormous strides in that, but again, these systems largely were developed as billing systems, not as research systems. So that's that, but and we're not going to solve that.
Right.
But we would hold out to those who do control those systems and make these decisions to realize this could have an absolutely transformational impact.
Right.
This is not, as a friend of mine likes to say, data composting, where we just want to take all the data and we put it in a big pile and hope something comes of it. We know what we would do with it. And what we need to know is, what did the doctor observe? What did the patient complain of in detail?
Right.
The second thing is that there the disorders which so the disorders, to answer your question, the disorders that will be the easiest to go after are those which have the best data.
Okay.
So again, that's a little plug for disease foundations. If you want your disease worked on,
Right.
please generate data that can be useful, detailed data, granular data. I think the other reason that what Doug said about neuropsychiatric diseases is so relevant, and where it will be the highest hanging fruit, I think, is that think about it from a clinical perspective. If you are unconscious, I can give you a diagnosis of cardiovascular disease.
Okay.
Because I can do an echocardiogram, I can do a coronary angiogram, I can do all kinds of things to you. I can stimulate your heart in various ways, I can do electrophysiology experiments. If you are unconscious, I can't tell anything about the nervous system. You have to talk to the patient. The only way to understand how the brain is working is we're doing now. You're listening to me, I'm listening to you, and that's the nature of the clinical interaction. And that's why it becomes so important for the doctor to write down what she or he observed in a way that is less necessary in a cardiovascular disease. We can still write down the clinical things that we were all taught in medical school, that this heart rhythm is, I listen to the heart with a stethoscope, but that's almost become kind of a clinical nicety to make the patient feel better. It doesn't really give a lot of information that you couldn't get otherwise.
Right.
But with nervous system diseases, it's not that way.
That's really interesting. And patient privacy, is that an issue? Or
well, of course.
Is it something you can work around?
But the thing which is different in common diseases, which is really different in rare diseases, is that you have large enough numbers that you can anonymize the population with minimal chance. It's never zero,
right.
but with much less chance of having the individual patient re-identified. With a rare disease,
right? If there are 12 people in the world with that disease,
really hard to
and
do
one is
anonymization.
Female, right?
Exactly, you got that right.
So another question from the audience: what challenges do you anticipate from a communications perspective as you shift to a long-standing way of approaching these illnesses? How do you communicate that message?
It's a real challenge. One of the reasons, among many, that biotechnology has focused so much on monogenic diseases is the concept is pretty simple. If you have a particular genetic mutation and that causes a particular disease, there's kind of a one-to-one correspondence. It's often more complicated than it looks, but nevertheless. And what we're talking about is if you have multiple things that conspire together to cause a particular disease, how do you communicate that? One way is, again, to try to simplify the problem to at least one aspect of its essence, which is it is about the biology. At the end of the day, something has gone wrong biologically, and that might, by the way, it may not be a single thing, but even if it's multiple things, there's often identifiable points of intervention. And I think that everybody can kind of grasp that. I mean, we experience that in other aspects of our lives, like when our car stops working or other things like that. It's obviously not quite as complicated there. But I think that there's another way to help people grasp this, which is to remind people of the importance of trying to do it. And in that we can point to examples from either recent history or from longer ago, so that people can kind of appreciate this. One example that makes a big impression, or has always made a big impression on me, is that when Chris and I were training as physicians in the mid-'80s was when the AIDS epidemic was just exploding. And so we were constantly caring for patients who were being diagnosed with AIDS. Right. They had no prospects, right. They had no hope. And not only that, but generally the way that they ended up passing away was extraordinarily painful. And 10 years later, a number of drugs and therapeutic strategies had been developed and approved, which converted this entirely hopeless situation into a situation of great hope for people. And now, and we still have to do better, of course, because we don't have a cure, we don't have a prevention, but nevertheless, people can live a largely normal life with a diagnosis of HIV positivity because of those advances in just a short period of time. Right. And so if you can imagine that paradigm of converting hopelessness to hope, and then think of the diseases that you might be worried about in your own family, particularly worried because so far there's no treatment, there's no hope, and imagine that you could then get that kind of hope. That's the kind of communication I think will get people excited, and we do think that technology is now available to actually deliver on it, and so we feel obligated to try.
Right.
Yeah, I think the other issue about communication, just thinking about your question, I think patients will, by and large, welcome this change. If you've ever had somebody in your family or had a common disease, it's frustrating.
Yes.
To hear that, well, we really don't know what brand of disease is, so you got to try the following 20 drugs and we'll see which one works, or some variation thereof. And many patients just give up. Whereas if you were able to say, no, Karen, you have this brand of disease, I think that will be an easy sell. We've talked about the FDA already. Physicians, I think, in large part will also welcome it, although it would be a different vernacular from them. But we've already seen this happen in some other areas of medicine, so I'd be optimistic about that. You know, interestingly, the biggest problem may be in actually the reimbursement system, because diagnostic codes, ICD codes, for instance, are embedded in every aspect of medical practice, and for a variety of very good reasons, the International Committee on Harmonization, which is the group that comes up with ICD codes, is reluctant to produce more or change them. And you can imagine that if a doctor or an insurance company has been dealing with Alzheimer's disease and now they've got 10 different Alzheimer's diseases, really? I don't think I want to do that. Right. I think there will be communication challenges there about what is the juice worth the squeeze here, and that's understandable. Right. But frankly, I look forward to that conversation, having that problem. Right. Exactly.
We're actually almost out of time. We have a couple of questions left. Maybe quickly, can you address how does a patient's environment influence? I mean, we know obesity obviously has huge environmental effects. How do you kind of parse that out?
It's another level of complexity,
Right.
and clearly in some cases one will have to get a real grasp of that as well. We have such a big mountain to climb here. Frankly, while we're 100% cognizant of that, we have to start where we can start.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's true. And when you think about it from our perspective, environment is another source of heterogeneity.
Right.
And heterogeneity is the enemy. So we would love to have the kind of granular data that we can now get from sequencing people's genomes for their environmental exposures. And there are some programs like the All of Us research program at NIH that's trying very hard to do that, doing great work on that. But it's really hard.
Right.
And
diversity is part of that. And
Sure.
Oh, of course, of course. And we see those environmental differences reflected in disease incidence and course and all of these things, but we don't know how to measure it.
Right.
And we don't have the tools to measure it. So you can imagine in the environmental world, it's where genome sequencing was in about 1980.
Okay.
So
we almost have the Huntington's gene.
we are right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And a lot of technical development.
And we still don't have a cure for Huntington's
either.
35 years
Yes,
later.
Right, exactly.
So sort of rapid answer here. You made this moving analogy with AIDS. Where are we 10 years from now? What are we going to have, what are we going to look back on when we get together 10 years from now and say we did this?
I don't know in which diseases we'll be able to make this claim, but I have 100% confidence that we will be able to offer to at least some people really meaningful interventions, as I said, either to arrest or reverse a disease or even to preempt a disease for something that today we can't even really see what the actual path will be, but I think that we have a blueprint for the path. And I look forward to being able to look a patient or a person in the eye and say, here is at least something that you don't have to worry about. I don't know whether it will be cardiovascular or metabolic or CNS. We should get together sometime between now and then.
Okay, the dates. Great. Chris, your
Exactly.
prognostications here?
No,
Your crystal ball?
couldn't have said it better myself. That's exactly what I'm looking forward to, too.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both so much. This has been really interesting and enlightening, and we all hope that your vision comes true for more than one condition, for many conditions. And yeah, we have a lot to look forward to, I hope.
Good.
Thanks so
Karen.
much.
Thank you.